Okay, so the essay that we decided to choose is actually from 2001, which kind of was a mistake. We didn't really find this on College Board, we found somewhere else, and we thought it was 2005. So the essay itself is actually number 3. It's the Jacksonian period, which is the topic of chapter 10. And we thought this question would be perfect because we had chapter 10 and 11, which was one about the Jacksonian period, as well as the other one, which is about slavery and abolitionist movements. And so we thought that we could actually put two of them together because it would directly correlate. So the question itself is, the Jacksonian period, 1824 to 1848, has been celebrated as the era of the common man. To what extent did the period live up to its characterization? Consider two of the following in your response: economic development, politics, and or reform movements. So we decided to choose politics and reform movements. Politics because we felt that that was just a better way to go. There was a lot part of it that we could build on. And reform movements because that actually connects with chapter 11 about slavery and all that kind of stuff. So the essay itself, we start off with the introduction. The two main ideas we had to talk about was President Andrew Jackson, and of course we needed a thesis. Now our thesis is a bit long for what it is, but it's kind of sets the tone for the rest of the essay. So we start off with speaking a little bit about Andrew Jackson himself as to why this is called the Jacksonian era and why, like, what's the idea behind the common man. So we spoke about Andrew Jackson himself and how he was. He didn't really grow up wealthy, unlike all of his predecessors who were from a wealthy family. And so because of his background as well as his values and ideals growing up, he didn't really have like the same viewpoint and ideology as other presidents. And so when he came into office, he expressed his ideas like pretty bluntly. He either liked it or he didn't. He either supported it or he didn't. And then during his time in office, like it says here, he revealed concern for individual rights, the farming community, and the average American. This pretty much defines as to what common man is. He himself was very much for the people, for the majority of the people, not just the wealthy class or just like the small percent of Americans in society. And so that really pushes the idea of common man, and it will later help develop the ideas that we come across. Okay, so our thesis is actually pretty long. It's despite living up to its characterization of the era of the common man in terms of increased societal involvement in politics and women's reform movements, the Jacksonian era failed to achieve African American equality. So that ties directly with chapter 11 about slavery, since Jackson was actually a huge supporter of slavery and he did not want to get rid of it because of where he comes from. However, it did embody, we wanted to do a little bit of comparison because there are some aspects of it that were definitely embodied the common man spirit, such as the women's reform movements and the increase in involvement in politics. But in terms of slavery, it was just not very effective. The idea of a common man was more of like common white man rather than just common man. So for the first paragraph, we decided to do white males in politics. So white males in politics usually is not necessarily a good thing because in the past, most Americans, they had to have a lot of property to be able to vote, or they needed to pay, this was after, they had to pay after. But before, most of the time, only whites could vote, of course. In this time, since there is no African American equality, only whites could vote still. But the only difference is there was a lot of increase in involvement in politics, since a lot of people were able to vote now, since during this time period the common man spirit pulled through and the voting requirements and qualifications were decreased. I mean, people didn't have to be well educated or didn't have to have a lot of property and be wealthy to be able to vote for something they want. So because of this, a lot of people were able to control parts of the government and who they wanted in power. And so this is the first aspect of the common man spirit. And so it's pretty well defined in terms of white male involvement in politics. Also, in addition, as it's written here, there is a change in the direct election of electors in the Electoral College, which is also an important aspect which ties with everything else. So this is the first part of it that was a huge part, since it changed a lot of things. I mean, having this many voters would definitely change something. If anyone in the future would like to run again, and they were not necessarily, just part of like the wealthy class, they probably could do so very successfully. As for the second paragraph, we chose to write about women's reform movements. So this is actually quite successful as well. In women's reform movements, there are actually many individual women, women who decided to stand out and take a stand. In the abolition movement, a lot of the women were very much involved because they actually had a chance to make a difference in having like different roles in society than like just the usual housewife and that kind of thing. As it's mentioned here, there's one huge reformer, which is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She was actually very successful in what she was doing. She was just one of the many women reform movement figures at the time, and she's mostly known for her role at Seneca Falls, specifically the convention in 1848, and it was demanding for the women's right to vote, which has been much of an issue at this time, since even though white males were allowed to vote, white females were not. And so they really try to fight for the right, as well as the way that women were mistreated in society and all aspects of life in general. They were just very much looked down upon because of their gender and the gender stereotypes at the time. So the Jacksonian era there was huge improvements in terms of women reform, and so a lot of women were able to do a lot of things that they weren't previously able to do. And of course, this was just starting off, which eventually in the future there would be more reforms and more changes that were even better for women. Okay, so that also ties back to the idea of a common man, because, well, common man isn't just person, but it ties back to the idea because it relates to how people are treating all together for the majority instead of just for one specific race, one specific gender. It's just really spreading out. Okay, so for body paragraph 3, we talk about, this is what chapter 11 had to deal with, the abolitionist movement and slavery. So in our essay, we talked about during the Jacksonian era, they were not successful at abolishing slavery at all, especially because it was Andrew Jackson's time, and if you had like a different president, maybe someone was more supportive, even though their ideology at the time was still really, they were really still interconnected with slavery. That was something that was practically impossible to get rid of. But maybe even if there was a different president, it would still not be very effective. So this is why it clashes with the idea of common man in Jacksonian era, because common man is supposed to be equal all across the board for every American. Unfortunately, it wasn't that equal for African Americans. Well, not that equal. It wasn't equal at all. I mean, slavery wasn't abolished, and African Americans were still not able to vote, and there were it was just, there was a lot of anger and anti-slavery, I mean, not anti-slavery, pro-slavery going on at the time, and since Jackson himself supported it so much, he did try his best to keep it intact despite all the anti-slavery movements, which were very much ineffective. I mean, it was good that it started, but even though it was the era of the common man, it did not necessarily get to be that way for African Americans. I mean, it's going to be a long while before, a bit more time before they actually gain any success. But at the time, they tried, but they failed, unfortunately. So that is how, that relates back to the chapter 11. As for the last paragraph, we have an overall idea of the essay. So it pretty much summarizes everything that I just mentioned. It improved the lives of white males as well as females, well, more or less. But it was not very successful in terms of African American, despite that coining it the term the common man is supposed to mean everyone in America. But it doesn't really play out that way, since there were still racial stereotypes and all the differences between people and different ideologies. So as conclusions, pretty much to sum up everything that was mentioned in the 3 body paragraphs. And so we looked, our goal was definitely, of course, the 8 to 9 essay. I hope that the essay is better than my explaining, because my explaining is pretty bad. Well, the 8 to 9 essay requires a clear, well-developed thesis that recognizes the extent to which the characterization is accurate. Our thesis, despite being relatively long, we thought that it was pretty good at meeting those requirements, because we played out both sides. We were doing a good and bad, despite the fact that it does meet the common man criteria in this aspect. It doesn't really meet it in terms of African American equality and all that kind of stuff. And yeah, so the thesis, it doesn't sound as clear as I would have hoped, but the idea is there. It's kind of hard to word it in a certain way. And the second part was that the thesis has to be supported with considerable relevant information. Of course, in the 3 body paragraphs, we talk about different aspects as to why, well, two reasons as to why it supports the fact that it's characterized as common man era, and one reason as to why it's not. So most of the information provided, we provided specific people's organizations, and also like just the overall idea of what was going on at the time in this time period. Third point that we have to look at is that it analyzes effectively 2 categories. Treatment of categories may be somewhat uneven. It is somewhat uneven just because we decided to do 2 for reform and then 1 for politics, but since that's pretty much the only way that's able to be done. So we did analyze the 2 categories because we spoke about the involvement in politics and the increase in involvement in politics and how it was really spreading out, and how it could benefit the future as well. And also we spoke about 2 different movements that were going on at the time, and whether they were successful or unsuccessful, and may contain minor errors. I'm sure there are errors. Well, that was basically what we were trying to follow. Wanted the 8 to 9 essay. Whether if it's there, it's hard to say. We're going to hope that it's there. Overall, the idea of the essay is that just despite the fact that it is Jacksonian era can be definitely classified as the common man era, it's not necessarily completely correct, because there are a few things that are not necessarily for all men, for all people. So yeah.